Welcome everyone. So wherever and whenever you may be, I'd like to welcome you to the Melbourne Graduate School of Education's Mathematics, Science and Technology Education Group webinar series. This is the October installment of the series. My name is Morris Toscano. I'm a senior lecturer in science education here at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. My sort of interests lie in the intersection between art, science and philosophy, and the intersection with that and science education. So I'm sort of very passionate about this particular topic, dealing with digital technologies and how they can really improve the experience of teachers and their effectiveness in the classroom and their sense of agency and personhood. I'm actually hosting this seminar today based in Melbourne. This is the ancestral land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And so I think it is fitting that I should acknowledge their custodianship and stewardship of this land upon which we meet, and recognise and acknowledge the Indigenous people who have occupied this land for many years. And I also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the Indigenous people and the custodians of the land where you may be today, and acknowledge that wherever we are in the world, that people have taken care of place. And so we should acknowledge that where we stand, where we work and where we do our research, that's where we stand. Before I begin introducing our guest speaker, what I would like to do is also introduce Emma Stevenson, who is going to be moderating the question and answer session after Emily's presentation. So I might pass over to Emma and allow her to introduce herself briefly.
Thank you so much, Morris. Just very briefly, because I'm thoroughly looking forward to hearing Em's presentation today. Very excited. It's an area of interest of mine. Just to introduce myself, as Morris said, my name is Emma Stevenson. I'm a lecturer in science education at Melbourne Graduate School of Education. And my research interests lie in STEM education, both specifically at the moment in STEM teacher education. And I'm in the midst of doing my PhD in that area at the moment. So that's a little bit from me at the moment, and I look forward to moderating the question and answer down the track. Thanks, Morris.
Thank you, Emma. Now, just in terms of the sort of running of today's seminar, the chat feature is not enabled, but instead what we have is the Q&A feature. Now you can pose questions, make comments, suggestions, and offer feedback through the Q&A feature at any time during Emily's presentation, and I encourage you to do so, so that by the end Emma has an opportunity to curate those responses. I also encourage you to use the question and answer section to also respond to other people's questions and elaborate on those, so that we can have a really rich conversation. I'm sure Emily is very keen to get feedback about her ideas, which are innovative and original. And so in terms of kind of expanding and improving her wonderful work, any feedback from you in terms of questions or comments would be most welcome. I should also remind you that today's session will be recorded. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Emily Rochette, who has recently and successfully completed her PhD thesis in science education, which she also undertook while being a classroom teacher. So this is she comes to us with this wonderful connection between sort of classroom practice and the research space and the intersection between those two. She's also been teaching in initial teacher education in science and chemistry education in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education since 2013, and has been a fabulous contributor to the space of scholarship and research within the MSTEG research group, and it's a real delight to always have conversations with Emily about her research and her ideas. And so I don't want to sort of stand in the way of her presentation about teaching geoscience out of field with digital technologies. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. So Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Morris. I'll just I just would like to share my screen with you now, so to share the presentation. So Morris, if you could stop sharing the screen, I will make the swap. Fantastic. Okay. Okay, yep. Okay, so first of all, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Morris and Emma, for that really fantastic introduction. I feel like I've got some big shoes to fill right now. And I'd like to thank the members of the audience for volunteering some of their time today to hear this talk that I think is pretty pertinent as we think about and reflect on teachers swiftly responding to the global pandemic, where they are expected to deliver lessons as students learn from home. And the attention has really focused on their use of digital technologies to facilitate teaching and learning. Now, this research was completed pre-pandemic and sought to understand the lived experience of 10 secondary science teachers as they prepared to teach an out-of-field discipline of the science curriculum with digital technologies. Now here, what I'll demonstrate for you is how positioning theory was utilized to understand teachers' evolving sense of agency at this curricular intersection. And I offer a three-dimensional model for professional learning to illustrate the relationships between the institutional and the subject-specific expectations placed on teachers. Now the model, I think, is particularly important in these challenging times and may not only be of value to education, but also to other sectors where professionals are required to continually refine their knowledge and skills in unfamiliar contexts. So let's begin with reflecting on the professional context within which science teachers in Australia complete their very important work. Now in Australia, science teachers are expected to teach across biology, chemistry, earth and space sciences, and physics, in addition to using information and communication technology as a general capability. This research examines teachers' perceptions of their experience at the intersection of the science and digital technologies curricula, where professional standards and education policy assign teachers predetermined lists of rights and duties to which they must attend. As skilled members of the profession using digital technologies, science teachers are expected to continually develop a professional capacity to utilize technologies throughout their career. They're expected to build skills toward utilizing digital technologies to support the advancement and communication of science in authentic contexts with their students. And they're also expected to refine their capacity to develop the knowledge, skills, behaviors, and dispositions that equip students to, quote, live and work successfully in the 21st century by teaching ICT through science inquiry. Now, within this context, two assumptions seem to be made about teachers as they negotiate these professional duties. One, that science teachers possess the breadth and depth of knowledge required to teach all disciplines of science. And two, that teachers know of and how to use digital technologies for distinct methods of inquiry. Notably, this research does not assume a deficit model of teacher knowledge, but seeks a more empowering and useful understanding of teachers' lived experience. So let's delve a little further into this context. Teaching out of field is a label referring to teachers either assigned or by choice to teaching subjects or year levels for which they have not undertaken specialist training. It's a contentious label. Now, drawing on data from the 2013 Staff in Australia's Schools survey, Weldon defines in-field teachers as those who have studied a subject for at least one semester at secondary or tertiary level with no tuition in subject-specific teaching methodologies, or they've met the above criteria and were instructed in subject-specific teaching methodologies. Defining in-field teaching in this way seems to value teachers' experience with discipline-based content and methods of inquiry. Having a major and teaching certification may also be useful for policy groups who advocate high standards for the recruitment of specialist teachers. However, this definition is problematic for multidisciplinary fields, such as general science, where teachers, despite being identified as in-field, are likely to be specialists in all science disciplines. Science teachers are really crossing boundaries when they instruct students in disciplines which they've not explored themselves and where familiar in-field practices may not be recognized as transferable or even appropriate to the out-of-field area. So here, I define science teachers teaching out of field as those who, although deemed subject specialists, are teaching disciplines of science for which they do not have specialization. Being offered this definition might call into question whether any science teacher could be considered in field. Although instances of teaching out of field are not of equal magnitude, understanding them is essential to accurately assessing the quality and performance of teachers, schools, and their students. So this research is situated within the geoscience meaning-making space to explore the experiences of science teachers teaching out of field. Geoscience is an interpretive science where cutting-edge technologies are utilized to study the processes acting on Earth's solid components. Although becoming more prominent in school curricula internationally, geoscience is largely taught by non-specialist general science teachers, for whom the geoscientific methods of inquiry may remain abstract because they're a little distinct from other science disciplines. For example, geoscientists utilize Google Earth to explore geospatial representations while collecting and displaying data. Google Earth has the potential to be used by school-age students for similar purposes. However, classroom activities with it tend to be short-lived and involve passive participation by students. Now, Creason and colleagues explain that the school subject will be a simplified form of the discipline according to how curriculum designers see fit to present that discipline to pupils. However, in schools, it's the teachers who are the designers of the enacted curriculum. And when they teach out of field, they may not identify or draw on appropriate transferable skills or scaffold the epistemic practices distinct from their specialist areas. Now, added to this complexity are the expectations for general science teachers to utilize digital technologies to teach science inquiry. The expectations for digital technology use in schools span national advisory bodies to curriculum policy to large-scale funding policies. For example, Geoscience Australia places emphasis on the importance of students understanding science and technology to understand the Earth for the benefit of Australia. The Productivity Commission explains that at a fundamental level, all workers will need the skills to interact with technology to improve Australia's labour market. Digital technologies have been utilised in Australian schools for some time, but the most significant funding from this came in 2008 with the digital education revolution. Over 5 years, the government pledged more than $2 billion to provide laptops to secondary students, improve infrastructure to support the use of the internet and digital devices in schools, provide resources to develop teachers and students' digital proficiency, and also enable parents to participate in their children's education. Although well-intentioned, the OECD has reported that countries investing heavily in ICT for education show no significant improvements to students' achievement in reading, mathematics, or science. Drawing attention to the Australian context, Fralian and colleagues explain that the use of ICT has yet to transform pedagogy and that digital literacy does not appear to be improving. Now, for some time, the literature has indicated that teachers' digital technology use varies considerably. Erdmer and colleagues explained that the true gatekeepers to teachers' technology use may be their beliefs about, quote, teaching computers established classroom practices and unwillingness to change. These barriers are value-laden and may act to compromise or even strengthen a teacher's perceptions of their empowerment to act. Now, a variety of theories and models have emerged from scholars' extensive study of technology adoption, including the theory of reasoned action, the technology acceptance model, and the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology, just to name a few. Although not specifically designed in the education context, reflecting on these theories and models sheds light on the complexity of the phenomenon. So according to the theory of reasoned action, an individual's intention to perform a behavior is a determinant of action, and two constructs contribute to a person's behavioral intention: the attitude toward behavior, which are the positive or negative feelings about, and the resulting consequences of enacting the behavior. So in a school setting, it might look like this. It's always a struggle to teach Excel, but if I don't do this, it will be more difficult when I get the year 11s next year. Now, behavioral intention is also informed by the subjective norm, the perceptions about the expectations of individuals held in esteem, and teachers' motivation to attend to these expectations. So this might look like this. My colleagues are exploring this technology in geoscience. I like to try new things too because it's interesting for me and my students. Now, the technology acceptance model is similar to the theory of reasoned action, where the use of technology is determined by an individual's behavioral intention. And this is informed by the perceived usefulness, beliefs about the extent to which a technology enhances job performance. So software X can enable students to learn concept Y from home, so we've got more time for practical activities in class. And I should mention that this idea of perceived usefulness presented is very teacher-centered, based on what a teacher's perceptions are of their possible enhances to job performance. Now, the behavioral intention is also influenced by the perceived ease of use. These are beliefs about the extent to which the technology use is free from effort and encompasses a sense of self-efficacy. The data loggers are easy to use, just plug them in and begin taking the measurements. Now, notably, perceived usefulness is tied to enhancement of job performance, but this may be difficult to apply to teaching and learning because the teacher's job performance can be viewed differently by distinct stakeholders. For instance, administrators may view a teacher to be performing well when students' standardized test scores improve, yet teachers may evaluate their personal job performance based on the development of pedagogical approaches promoting conceptual change, which are not necessarily measured by standardized tests. Now, the technology acceptance model doesn't include the subjective norm due to the, quote, uncertain psychometric status of it. For quantitative research, this decision seems to have merit. However, teaching is a relational profession where shared narratives of a teacher's successes and failures of technology use and their colleagues' expectations of themselves and each other may certainly influence decisions about the extent to which technologies are adopted. So Venkatesh et al. Have summarized 8 theories and models for technology adoption to develop the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology. This model is comprised of 4 constructs, 3 of which are similar to the theory of reasoned action and the technology acceptance model. Performance expectancy is the extent to which an individual believes that the technology will lead to gains in job performance. Effort expectancy is the degree of ease associated with the use of the technology. Social influence is the extent to which an individual perceives that others held in esteem believe the individual should use the technology. And finally, facilitating conditions are the extent to which an individual believes that existing organizational and technical infrastructures exist to support the use of the technology. Now, the unified theory of acceptance and use of technology addresses the limitations of the technology acceptance model by accounting for individual differences affecting technology adoption, including gender, age, experience, and voluntariness of use. Yet, it may not capture the complexities of the educational context. For example, there seems to be an assumption that if the facilitating conditions exist, moderated by experience and age, individuals will enact the behavior. However, teachers have considerable autonomy in the private space of the classroom, where experience may lead them to reason. I know the support exists, but I'm not going to access it because I can do the same thing to get results without the technology. So I think this idea of the voluntariness of use comes into play at different aspects. And it might not be influenced by the social influence of others working within the context of teaching and learning, where it could be very personal to me, for example. Now, Shearer and colleagues postulate that teachers may be likely to adopt new technologies once they're able to perceive them as relevant to the subject-specific goals. And scholars have distinguished between technology integration and technology-enabled learning. The difference between frequently appropriating digital technologies versus emphasizing the pedagogical practices for supporting students' content-based learning. Previously, Google Earth was highlighted as an accessible digital technology that students could utilize in the classroom. Drawing on the affordances of Google Earth for science inquiry, however, has been found to depend on the user's grasp of their own geoscience content knowledge and technological knowledge, which highlights a further complexity at the intersection between the geoscience meaning-making space and teachers' use of technologies. In addition to this, Australian teachers are not only expected to utilize technology for subject-specific purposes, but also in a school for administrative purposes. The web-based learning management system Compass, for example, is currently used in many schools with a company website asserting that the software, quote, drives operational efficiency, improves learning outcomes, and enables better communication. Now, claims like this seem to herald the digital technologies with instilling business-like organizational efficiencies of educational institutions, which may ultimately reflect the needs and desires of administrators more so than classroom teachers. The theories and models of technology adoption presented do not account for instances where technology use doesn't fall neatly within this mandated versus voluntary borders, where teachers as trained professionals may assert a right to choose which technologies and how to use them in the classroom. Scaffolding teachers to explore the pedagogical possibilities with digital technologies and perhaps negotiate new roles for themselves and their students will begin with supporting them with initial steps toward change while possibly identifying areas where professional learning can take place. As such, this research responds to an important area of exploration as teachers negotiate expectations to utilize digital technologies across their institutional and subject-specific duties to teach out of field. 2 research questions guided this research. How do secondary science teachers assess their use of digital technologies to meet professional duties to teach in field? And how do they assess their use of digital technologies to meet the professional duties to teach out of field? The overarching methodology for this research design was positioning theory. And what you're seeing on the screen right now is a positioning triad, a framework to better understand an individual's interpretation of the system of rights and duties within which intentional acts are done. For positioning theorists, meaning making becomes evident through an individual's discursive practices. These are the verbal and non-verbal symbolic exchanges that are indicative of the normative frames through which people think, feel, act, and perceive. Discursive practices can be recorded as individuals participate in interviews, offer written responses to prompts, or through observation. Positions arise from discursive practices and indicate power imbalances connected to an individual's perceptions of agency. As individuals are positioned, they possess a limiting repertoire of acts to negotiate the social episode. For example, using digital technologies is recorded as part of a teacher's role through contractual agreements. However, the extent to which teachers accept this positioning may depend on their interpretation of the assigned duty and their personal capacity to assume it. Thus, positions are distinct from roles in that they're dynamic, changing moment to moment in conversation. Now, the extent to which positions are accepted or rejected are influenced by the history of interactions, signaling plots, and storylines. To understand the storylines emerging from teachers' professional landscapes, I draw on distinctions between the cover, sacred, and secret stories. Cover stories are promoted by school administrators to the wider community. At our school, we have technologically advanced learning spaces for students developing those 21st century skills. Sacred stories are the theory-driven view of practice shared by teachers, policymakers, and theoreticians. For example, teachers should use digital technologies to teach inquiry practices in science. And the secret stories are about classroom practice that can indicate tension between the cover and the sacred stories. These are my favorite stories, and they include stories like, I don't know how to use digital technologies to teach inquiry. What are those 21st century skills anyway? Now, this presentation reports on the findings from 10 teacher participants from an inner city government school in Melbourne, Australia, 4 of whom will be the focus for today. To varying extents, teachers participated in this study over 2.5 years by volunteering to participate in semi-structured interviews and focus groups where they shared their experiences through verbal and written communication. Some examples are provided on the slide. In addition, school curriculum documents and notes from classroom observations were collected and analyzed. Constructivist grounded theory coding procedures were utilized to make analytic sense of the data and teachers' discursive practices. Pronoun grammar analysis aided in the fine-grained analysis of the textual data, and this table exemplifies some of the discursive practices that enabled me to understand teachers' perceptions of their rights and duties while tracking shifts in their storylines. After initial coding, focus codes were refined and raised to categories to track changes in teachers' perceptions prior to and while teaching out of field with digital technologies. And we'll see some examples how this all worked right now. So let's talk about teachers' technology use for in-field disciplines. Now, to varying extents, teachers assume professional duties to teach science with digital technologies. Despite these teachers working in a very well-resourced school, they continued to face barriers compromising effective technology use. And these included compatibility problems with devices, insufficient personal and professional history using technology, and concerns about best practice. As teacher self-assessments were analyzed and compared, a continuum of digital technology use emerged, ranging from technology integration toward technology-enabled learning. So frequently using the technology toward using the technology for those inquiry practices. Consider the reflections from 4 teachers. Charlotte, a junior science and senior biology and chemistry teacher with over 25 years experience, explained, when you're in a science classroom, it's more about designing experiments and knowing how to. So I'm always concerned about teaching the kids how you design an experiment well so that the data you gather is meaningful. I think that we like to keep abreast of what the new frontiers are. Digital technology is the latest frontier. Now, Charlotte draws on the pronoun I to explain her personal commitment to a professional duty she accepts as part of her regular practice, using technology to collect and analyze data. Speaking on behalf of teachers, she positions them with this duty in addition to keeping up to date with the latest technological developments. Charlotte is empowered to utilize data loggers and simulations to produce lessons where students regularly develop those inquiry skills. As such, a sacred story emerges. I'm a competent technology user, and I teach digital skills needed for planning and carrying out experiments. At the time of data collection, Rachel was in her first year of teaching after contributing to a variety of research projects in the biological sciences. Here, Rachel's reflecting on a professional duty to selectively utilize digital technologies to enhance her lessons. Rachel explains how she was empowered to seize an opportunity to discuss and model those critical thinking skills required to conduct effective internet searches. However, excuse me, other reflections that Rachel shared seem to indicate that she may struggle to do this with technology she knows of but hasn't personally explored. As such, her sacred and secret stories are in tension. I'm able to teach students those digital skills with some technologies, but I struggle to integrate others, even though I know that they'd add value. Ethan was in his second year of teaching after spending 10 years as a research scientist in immunology. Here, he shares his own technological knowledge while reflecting on the digital skills that he expects his students to develop. For Ethan, digital literacy is an important component to completing schoolwork, yet the final sentence of the term suggests that he may not assume a professional duty to teach it. A secret story emerges. I'm a teacher of science, not technology. Isabel had taught junior science and mathematics and senior chemistry for over 13 years. Here, Isabel explains how she draws on a trusted resource, the textbook, to utilize interactive software produced by publishers. She positions herself as a chemistry specialist, emphasizing that there are even modeling activities for the periodic table and formation of compounds. Although Isabel assumes a professional duty to use technologies, she really struggles to articulate how they develop student science understanding skills beyond, quote, emphasizing points. Her self-assessment seems to reflect the cover story. Teachers at this school regularly utilize digital technologies. Now, these reflections and analyses are offered as examples to demonstrate how teachers' perceptions of their technology use were raised to categories along a continuum of digital technology use. Charlotte was an expert. She sought out and learned how to use and adapt digital technologies to emphasize science inquiry skills. Rachel was an apprentice. She identified the digital skills students were expected to develop, yet she felt conflicted about translating those professional duties into practice. Ethan was placed in the Novice 2 category, where he was able to identify those digital skills that students were expected to develop, but he didn't assume a duty to teach them. And Rachel was placed in the Novice 1 category, where she assumed a duty to utilize digital technologies frequently, but she had trouble identifying those digital skills students were expected to develop and may have lacked the confidence to teach some of them. Notably, teachers were not presumed to sit discreetly within these boundaries. For instance, Isabel struggled to identify digital skills to teach students. However, she did assume a professional duty to do so when supported with technologies that were used across the entire science faculty. An example of this is Microsoft Excel. So let's shift gears a little bit and think about the digital technologies that teachers could possibly use in the geoscience meaning-making space. Now, at the time of data collection, Charlotte and Isabel had a personal history teaching geoscience, but Rachel and Ethan didn't. However, their perceptions of the possibilities for digital technology use in this area are worthy of reflection to better understand the support that could be offered in this uncharted territory. Here, teachers' reflections are exemplified to demonstrate how a continuum of awareness for digital technology use in geoscience emerged. Charlotte explains her transferable practices with the data logging equipment while demonstrating rock and mineral formation. When you do the cooking, you can incorporate it, making toffee and the modeling the formation. You can add it in the making of it using your temperature sensors and say, what kind of temperatures do you need to get this happening? Of significance is that Charlotte reflects on incorporating temperature sensors and data logging equipment into the activity. As an expert technology user, Charlotte seeks out and learns how to utilize and adapt digital technologies for inquiry in the out-of-field area. As such, the sacred story emerging is, my digital practices are transferable even when teaching out of field. Here, Isabel reflects on the feature film Dante's Peak, which she used at the end of the unit about plate tectonics. This reflection seems to indicate that Isabel attends to a self-ascribed duty to reward students, but she acknowledges her approach does not reflect best practice. Notably, the film could be utilized by teachers with more established geoscience pedagogical content knowledge to challenge students to evaluate the film's poor science communication to the public. For Isabel, however, a secret story emerges. Sometimes I use technologies as a reward, but without learning intentions. Being a first-year teacher, Rachel experienced a variety of activities for teaching geoscience through her initial teacher education. She reflected on ways to prepare for new topics, and then she explained technology she perceived would be of benefit in the geoscience meaning-making space. Here, Rachel positions the textbook as enabling her to identify and understand the extent to which topics could be taught. She positions students with duties to utilize the internet to find factual information, a lower order thinking activity that seems to mirror a use of the textbook. As such, a secret story emerges. I'm planning to attend to my professional duties, but I'm really not sure what they are. Finally, Ethan was in his second year of teaching when he reflected on the possibilities for technology use in geoscience. I'm not sure about what's out there. Despite being able to identify digital skills students should develop while learning science, Ethan did not reflect on those skills as being transferable to the out-of-field context. Now, similar to teachers' reflections of digital technology use in in-field science disciplines, these reflections demonstrate how teachers' perceptions of their existing and possible technology use in geoscience were raised to categories along an awareness continuum. By recognizing her transferable skills in the in and out-of-field teaching space, Charlotte had an acting awareness. Rachel and Isabel had an awareness through their existing practices, but differed in that Isabel was able to identify some possibilities for digital technology use, but they reflected technology integration practices. Whereas Rachel expressed a possibility for digital technology use in preparation for teaching geoscience, but needed support to better understand how this could be translated to science inquiry. Ethan was unaware of those technologies and he would require support recognizing and employing transferable skills as well as scaffolding him to utilize technologies for inquiry. Now, both of these continuous served as useful frameworks to plan a unit of work intended to build the capacity of teachers to teach geoscience with digital technologies. However, some teachers unexpectedly reflected on an institutional use of digital technologies they felt it was important to communicate. Here, Rachel is reflecting on a whole school initiative that positioned teachers with professional duties to utilize a curriculum mapping software to formally document the curriculum for staff and parents. Speaking as a science coordinator, Isabel explained, I think that it's useful to have there for the parents to see, but in terms of helping staff, I don't think it's actually quite useful. You can't put anything on there. That's my opinion, but what do I know? Drawing on the personal pronoun I, Isabel explains that using this software does not align with teachers' needs. Members of her team held similar perceptions by asserting professional rights to have an efficient method of accessing classroom resources. As such, Isabel's reflection signals a tension between the cover and the sacred story, where administrators have overclaimed for the suitability of this software to meet the distinct needs of a variety of stakeholders. Isabel finished the turn with frustration. That's my opinion, but what do I know? As science coordinator, she rhetorically questioned what she perceived as a lack of trust in the teaching staff to enact the curriculum professionally as they are held accountable for a task that did not appear to strengthen or respond to their needs. Thus, a secret story is emerging. The purpose of the work we're tasked with is unclear because it doesn't meet our subject-specific needs. Tonder and colleagues explain that mismatches between the anticipated change and the meanings attached to it by those instrumental in change processes often lead to failed technology adoption. Teachers' decisions to utilize technology are largely influenced by practicality ethic as they acknowledge the feasibility and benefits for technology use within the constraints of classroom practice. Overall, these teachers' reflections indicate that to varying extents, they may benefit from targeted support to identify and enact the pedagogical possibilities for digital technology use in the out-of-field context. These findings are supported by the work of scholars who explain that professional learning must be tailored and respond to the needs of individual teachers. Ertmer's work from the late 90s remains relevant to teachers' present lived experience as she explains the necessity for pragmatic strategies to be in place for teachers to become effective technology users. Now, to meet these teachers' needs and self-ascribed rights to efficiently access resources, a number of strategies were put in place. First, the curriculum mapping software was updated, linking classroom resources through Google Drive, a cloud computing database. Second, to provide an entry point for technology users with distinct skills and levels of personal history teaching geoscience, these teachers were offered detailed lesson plans with options for differentiated instruction. Digital technologies were introduced on a developmental continuum from those the teachers were familiar with to technologies new to their practice. And finally, instructions modeling the step-by-step processes for digital technology use were included in lesson plans and videos for both teachers and students to use from home. Now, these teachers were then offered this unit of work and taught it. So we're going to fast forward now to the findings from 2 years later. Now, findings from these teachers' perceptions of their pedagogical journeys suggest that perhaps this approach to professional learning may offer a model that is situated at the intersection between teachers' administrative and subject-specific duties. Before presenting this model, I'd like to unpack 2 established models of teacher change to reflect on what emerged from this study. Earlier models of professional learning propose that changes in knowledge and beliefs lead to changes in classroom practice, and finally to change in student learning outcomes. Like earlier models, the model of teacher change is linear. However, the earlier models assume that change in knowledge and beliefs come first, do not gain strong teacher commitment because teachers have yet to experience the changes in student outcomes. Guskey's model, however, makes 2 crucial assumptions that practicing teachers would question. The first is that teachers experience the professional learning homogeneously and meet the learning outcomes to the same extent. The second is that the institutional setting within which the professional learning is offered has the organizational practices and infrastructure in place to support sustained development. Findings from this research indicate that these assumptions cannot be overlooked. Clark and Hollingsworth offer a cyclic model presenting 4 domains of the teaching landscape to illustrate an iterative change process. The interconnected model acknowledges teachers' distinct professional learning experiences and highlights that learning is continual. However, the arrows indicating reflection and enactment from the external domain seem to assume that the source of information or stimulus is not only reflected upon, but also enacted. For instance, teachers participating in this study experienced mandatory institutional professional learning from administrators seeking to implement the curriculum documentation software. Such forms of professional learning may not be readily reflected upon and enacted as professional learning that teachers perceive to be useful for achieving their professional duties in the classroom. Now, Martin has explained that positioning theory offers theoretical resources to understand teacher professional learning and agency. This research employed a rigorous and robust research process to better understand the relationships that a teacher has to the outside influences that come from the broader institutional setting. Here, I present the explicit personal pragmatic approach to professional learning, a 3-dimensional model that places teachers at the center of their work as they negotiate the cover, sacred, and secret stories and are supported to understand and reflect on what they're professionally held accountable for and personally able to do. The explicit personal pragmatic approach illustrates the types of significant relationships and the need for explicit connections between the institutional expectations, the cover story, and the subject-specific pedagogical practices, the sacred story. Of note is that the term explicit as opposed to visible, has been deliberately chosen. Making practices explicit means providing sign systems and offering strategies to not only scaffold awareness of and connection between institutional and subject-specific pedagogical practices, but also to respect and invest in teachers' capacity as professionals by clearly and actively signaling possibilities for teachers to make professionally informed choices to act. In this way, teachers can be afforded distinct opportunities to position and reposition themselves as increasingly agentic. Teachers' personal and professional growth across these storylines is an ongoing and dynamic process. Through spatially and temporally located social episodes, an individual teacher's beliefs about her or his rights and duties intersect those of administrators, theoreticians, policymakers, students, parents, and other teachers. An interplay offering opportunities to fully and partially assume or outright reject the professional duties assigned to teachers through the moment-to-moment positioning of self and others. Both external and internal factors, including the support mechanisms offered and teachers' beliefs, can, to varying extent, strengthen and or even compromise a teacher's sense of agency. This means teachers must understand what they're professionally held accountable for in terms of their institutional duties and how attending to them can possibly strengthen their practice through ongoing training and support. Linehan and McCarthy explain that as individuals assume distinct positions, the moment-to-moment openness in prosaic acts can enable understanding of how a participant's selfhood emerges and is enacted in particular moments. For these reasons, Arrowheads have been added to the diagram to illustrate the significance of the dynamic space within which teachers work and negotiate their professional identities. Now, as an insider researcher, I am well aware of the accepted secret story within the teaching profession. This is just another decree from the ivory tower. When we go home, it doesn't really matter. Now, therefore, I'd like to offer the following recommendations that exemplify how the approach might be implemented. 1, school leadership must work toward offering and sustaining formal programs of digital experiences for students that are informed by subject specialists. School leadership, theoreticians, and policymakers must work toward developing programs that support teachers to assess, develop, and enact their personal and professional capacity to facilitate these experiences with students. Teachers must be afforded the time and space to meaningfully plan for and enact these experiences together and with subject specialists through the support from policy and leadership, such that new technologies are implemented and in stages. Programs for professional experiences should be included as part of a teacher's assessment practices, digital experiences, should be included as part of a teacher's assessment practices and stipulated within school policy documents. Theoreticians and school leadership should develop and provide differentiated professional learning opportunities for teachers, which take into account not only their teaching experience, but also their pre-existing skill sets for targeted professional growth. And finally, for these programs to be sustained, supportive timetabling practices must be in place for teachers to consistently develop and refine their pedagogical practices. Now, the findings of this research contribute to the literature about the use of digital technologies in education and the out-of-field teaching experience. The explicit personal pragmatic approach has the potential to contribute to the work of other scholars who have drawn attention to the out-of-field teaching experience in broad multidisciplinary subjects. Research about teacher knowledge in mathematics, for example, has much in common with the context of science education, and often literature seems to be directed at both audiences. As such, the explicit personal pragmatic approach could be applied to other subject areas or even professions where workplace professionals are required to continually refine their knowledge and skills in unfamiliar contexts. Finally, it's worth noting that the recommendations of this research are especially timely, as teachers are expected to rapidly develop the competencies to facilitate students learning at a distance. Thank you so much for listening. I'll hand it back to Morris and Emma because I'd be really interested in hearing the comments and questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a brilliant presentation, and I could really kind of imagine the sort of space of duties that has opened up around the teacher and that wonderful interaction between the sort of the institution and the teacher, particularly in the context of digital technology and out of field experience. So what I'm going to do now is invite people to continue to put questions in the Q&A section that Emma will draw upon in order to have a conversation with Emily about her presentation. So I do encourage you to put questions there. And so I'm going to hand over to Emma now to start that process of dialogue. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Morris, and thank you, Em, for an amazingly brilliant presentation. It was just so interesting. Just while people are popping their questions into the Q&A, I've just got a couple of things that I'd like to ask you, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I was really intrigued with your model, and particularly the differences between your model and the previous two that you critiqued just before. And I noticed that yours is 3D in nature, and I was just wondering if you could explain why you took sort of that approach within your model.
Oh, that's a great question, Emma, and it's one that I sort of grapple with trying to think about how to explain this. And I suppose what was not spoken about in the presentation was the fact that I was heavily influenced by defining what beliefs, attitudes, values, and behavior change were. And when I was reading work by Rokeach, I was struck by the idea that beliefs can be held central or peripheral in this sort of belief system, where these beliefs that are centrally held are very difficult to change. And they might include beliefs about self, self-enhancing beliefs, or maybe self-deprecating beliefs, whereas beliefs held peripheral in the belief system tended to be matters of choice. So I think one of the reasons why I wanted it to reflect a 3D nature was that those internal ideas of beliefs that teachers are experiencing are, you know, we don't just classify beliefs as, oh, it's just something someone believes. They could be held very central in that belief system. And of course, making changes to those types of beliefs is very difficult.
Thank you, Em. And I guess that sort of leads on to my next question, which was relating to one of your recommendations, which related to, I think you mentioned them being supportive timetabling practices. And your recommendation that schools need to have this in place in order for success for the teachers. I was just wondering if you could elaborate further on this in terms of what it looks like in practice in relation to your study.
Okay, so in practice, one of the things that I found was quite, one of the frustrations that many of the teachers expressed was the fact that they would get, say, Year 9 science one year, and then the next year they'd have a whole different load, which didn't include Year 9 science. So after the 2.5 years, I asked the teachers, you know, was there something that you put in place after participating in this unit of work? And I just seen the question from Kay Stacy there, and I'll maybe address part of this here too, because we not only introduce teachers to these technologies that could be used in the science classroom, one of the things that we wanted to move forward with is getting teachers very familiar with the use of Google Drive and cloud computing software, and teaching students those what I call organizational technology skills, which I think Google Drive has great affordances, and I think I can see a lot of schools incorporating this more and more with things like Microsoft OneNote. And so when we surveyed when we interviewed the teachers 2.5 years later, one thing that was interesting that came up was they said, well, actually I didn't get to teach Year 9 geoscience again, which was frustrating because they couldn't develop those science-specific digital technology skills for their practice. But what they did reflect on was the ability to utilize this kind of organizational technologies. So Rachel, for example, 2.5 years on, had said, oh, I tried the Google Drive thing with my students in biology. And she then taught that to another colleague who was also teaching biology at the same time. So that was quite interesting. But that frustration is certainly there. You know, when you put all this work as a teacher into you know, scaffolding their skills, and then the next year they're like, oh, well, I can't use that again.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've all experienced that incredibly frustrating process in schools, even if we can understand, I guess, the practicalities of schools also. I think that's answered Kay's question there, where she said, I wonder if you found differences in your results related to discipline-specific software and generic communications. So I think you were saying there that you found that teachers were using much more of that generic software, I guess, rather than more specific digital technologies.
Yeah, and I think for participants like Isabel, that software using the Google Earth and the Google Drive was something that was so different to her practice. It was actually quite stressful. So, you know, when we were introducing the students to the software too, the students had their student Google Drive, and they had all of the resources, and they were taught ways to download and edit particular documents and things like that. Getting that into a regular practice was something that was really quite stressful. So it had to do with sort of this idea of repetition, and here's how you do it. And they were also offered 24/7 support, really. I was working at the school at the time, so they could say, oh, Em, have you got a minute? Can I just, you know, and that's one of the reasons why too we made those videos. That was after piloting the unit of work with Rachel. So, you know, saying that if you're at home and if you can't remember, if you get an email from a student, you can actually do this on your own. But the shift to that, once they got into using that as part of the everyday practice in the classroom, open your Google Drive, we're going to look at this file, yada, yada, they seem to feel more comfortable with that.
Good, excellent. And I just, I've got a comment from Jenny here, who's a pre-service teacher, and she's saying, from a pre-service teacher perspective, where new teachers are motivated to incorporate digital technologies in their out-of-field study, but not supported by the school or institution, where can they go for support? Very practical question there.
Oh, that's an excellent question, Jenny. Well, there's a lot of networks out there on Facebook and things like that for pre-service teachers to sort of run ideas past each other and things like this. And I think we were very lucky at this school because we had the autonomy to teach the way we wanted to teach in the classroom. And then we had to use standard assessment tasks across classes. But Jenny, I would encourage you, talk to your colleagues. You will find your people in a school. And like Charlotte, for example, she was my person. You know, if I wanted to run a new idea by her, she would say, oh, have you tried this yet? And it was really interesting too, developing that relationship, because well after we had finished this research, Charlotte, she still continues to fire me emails today saying, oh, I tried this. Have you seen this thing with geoscience? So Jenny, when you're in a school, you've got your faculty that will hopefully support you. And then I'd also encourage you to speak to others. You know, you might find that in the English faculty, they're exploring things like Microsoft OneNote and class notebooks or something like this. And I just see, Emma, I'm looking at the Q&A from anonymous attendee. He feels that teachers are left to their own devices. Yeah. And I don't have an answer for that one. I completely understand why there is that understanding. Another participant in this survey, Anthony, who is also an early career teacher, pointed out, and he was new to the school, he pointed out that there was really no fixed ways to utilize digital technology across the science faculty. So, and Anthony found that quite frustrating because he wanted to explore students' movie making, for example, and wanted to make science fun in that kind of way. But he said, without knowing what I can do or what I can't do in this very new space, he felt a little bit uncomfortable there. So I think in terms of correct subject-specific technology use, it's really hard to define. And when you work with subject specialists in those areas, you can open a whole new world of understanding. But then again, that is dependent on the subject specialist being there and working with the teachers.
Thanks, Em. And I noticed that a thank you to Matt, who's put some ideas in the chat there, if anybody would like to refer to those, which is really wonderful. Thanks, Matt. We've probably got time for maybe one more question. Would that be right, Morris? We've got here from an anonymous person, but I think it's a great question in relation to your model, Em, which I know you were looking for some feedback on. So do you see your model applying to teacher change in the use of digital technologies only, or teacher change in general?
That's a really great question, anonymous attendee, and it gets me quite excited because, you know, I only looked at this very small space, but I think, and I mean, I think this is where future research might benefit from maybe evaluating this model, is by exploring how it might be used in other professions where that is not related to digital technology. So in my reading, I've come across a lot of studies in nursing and midwifery, for example, where these kind of professionals are expected to develop new skills often very quickly. And I think that the main aspect of the model that's so important is it's about the personal sense of job satisfaction, but also that sort of the institutional practices that are expected. And sometimes people might feel a little bit frustrated when they can't quite see, well, how is this helping me in my day-to-day practice? So I'd really welcome any feedback from people in other areas other than digital technology to discuss that with.
Thank you, Em. That might be a fun conversation for us to have at another time. I'd really enjoy that. A thank you to Wee Tiong and Yan, who have also popped questions in the Q&A there. Maybe I can record those and you can chat about those at another time, Em, because I think we're short of time. And I will say thank you for an amazing presentation. I really enjoyed that and I've loved having this conversation. But on that note, I'll pass back to Maurice.
Yes, thank you, Emma. That last question was a fabulous question, because I think it shows that there is a conversation to be had. And the wonderful thing about Emily's presentation is she's introduced new language and new ideas and new insights, which will really invigorate the conversations we have around teacher practice, around out-of-field teaching, and the introduction to digital technologies, but moving well beyond that. And I think it's a great way of rejuvenating and inspiring people who are interested in education, both theoretically and practically. So, I'd like to thank Emma for a wonderful curation of those questions and the conversation that followed. I'd like to thank the audience members for their participation and their, especially through the questions. But most of all, I'd like to thank Emily for presenting a fabulous seminar that I hope will be inspiring, and I'm sure she will welcome you to get in contact with her through MGSE if you want to continue the conversation or learn more about this. It just leaves me with one more thing, which is to advertise the next seminar in the series, which will be on Wednesday, November the 25th. That's with Sarah Buckley from ACER. So please put that in your diary and come back and join our math, science, technology and education group conversation. So I hope you have a wonderful evening, morning, day, wherever you are, and welcome you back in a few weeks' time for our next seminar. So thank you so much.